Yes, thank you very much for having me. Yes, in fact, Ukraine's membership of the EU is one of the areas where there is no obvious division. In the poll which we carried out in 10 EU member states in May this year, 57% of Europeans across all the states covered together supported the idea of Ukraine membership, so a very clear majority.
Tell us more about what the new research shows about public sentiment over where the war is headed.
So there is strong consensus among European citizens about Russia's responsibility for the war, and around 3/4 actually of the respondents identified Russia as being solely responsible for what's happening in Ukraine. But where there is a growing divergence that we identify is on how long and how long the conflict should be allowed to go on, and how long and how that should be resolved. So essentially what we've identified is that there is what we call a peace camp, those people who just want the conflict to end as soon as possible, the loss of life to finish regardless of the cost. And then what we're calling a justice camp, those who prefer that Russia is made to pay for what it has done in Ukraine and its attacks on the international system more broadly, even if that implies some concessions. Just to be clear, we're not saying here that consensus can't be found around ongoing European support for a robust position against Russia. But what we are saying is that understanding these two different camps, what their fears are, will be important for European policymakers in order to get their messaging right to appeal to both camps.
And trying to understand what's happened, those in the peace camp also acknowledge that Ukraine will be worse off compared to Russia as a result of the war.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the peace and justice divide is present in every country, and it's not a split between different parts of the European Union. So the justice camp is strongest in Poland. Poland is the one country where this is the larger group. But the extent to which the peace camp is present varies considerably across the EU states. And it's not only about geography. You know, you have quite a strong peace camp contingent in Romania at 42%. But then also in Germany, further away from the conflict at 49%. And I think it's important to be clear that the peace camp isn't pro-Russia. There are some pro-Russian or anti-American voters in parts of it. But the majority of those who form this camp do want Ukraine's victory and support tough policies against Moscow. But what worries them is the danger of escalation. And the fact that the longer this goes on, the more it could impact on the EU as well.
And this divergence of views that you've noted here, in turn, how will these affect how much military, economic and social support Europe provides to Ukraine?
Well, I think that there is, it will be important for European leaders in appealing to the peace camp to be very clear that this conflict remains a defensive one from the EU's point of view, that we're engaged in this in defence of the EU's security interests, as well as in solidarity with Ukraine. That this is not just about doing the right thing, but the ongoing measures are about doing what we need to do to guarantee our own security. And I do believe that there is an opening as we head to the summits at the end of this month, the G7, the NATO summit and the EU summit, for this message to be brought home, for a tough further package to be agreed against Russia before, as we head into the autumn, and energy costs continue to rise, the economic costs of the sanctions against Russia continue to be felt, before this potential for disunity begins to grow.
Do you think this difference in opinion is expected to widen as the war drags on?
I think inevitably we can begin to identify a sense of conflict fatigue. But what we've been looking at particularly here is the tolerance for the different types of measures which Europeans will continue to countenance as the costs are felt at home. And what we can see very clearly are that the biggest concerns among European voters are indeed about rising energy costs and the association of that with the energy sanctions against Russia. But then also about the risk of escalation of this war becoming a conflict involving NATO. And I think this is where the lower tolerance levels for military intervention among Europeans comes from. They're very nervous about anything that could provoke a further escalation of the conflict from Moscow.
And can I ask you what you think most Ukrainians think about this? Do you think most of them would fall into the peace or the justice camp?
I think that's a good question. I think that Zelensky as a leader is emblematic of the justice camp, and he seems to enjoy strong support from the Ukrainian people. So I think we could infer from that that the Ukrainians are more like the justice camp in terms of how they're thinking about the war. And that is why I think it's incumbent on European leaders to communicate in a way which takes the peace camp along with the tougher measures on Russia in order to support the Ukrainian people, who ultimately will be the ones who decide how and when this conflict ends.
Susie Dennison, thanks for explaining that research to us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.